Welcome back. I'm Tim Adams of Tomato Productions, and this month we're talking about equipment, specifically equipment that you need to shoot your own video content. And this week we're going to be talking about camera again. Last week we talked about shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. This week we're going to be talking about focus, focal length, and shooting modes. So first up is focus, and us in the industry, we like to have what we call tack sharp focus. That means that things are completely in focus, but only the things that we want to have in focus. You're not getting blurry images, or what we call soft images. It's sharp. Sharp is good, all right? Something to think about is your eyesight can directly affect how well you're able to tell what critical focus is when you're shooting content or when you're taking pictures. So a lot of cameras these days, if not most of them, have what we call a diopter adjustment. So the viewfinder that you're looking through when you're looking through the camera will have a small adjustment to compensate for differences in eyesight. So for example, I have 20/10 vision, which means I can see really, really well. And so I can look at a small video screen and I can tell whether things are in focus or not. Now I can tell you that in the last few years that's starting to degrade a little bit. So for me, I'm probably, next time I go and get my eyes checked, it's going to be 20/20. And so there's going to be a difference there that I have to adjust to. But those of you with glasses, you kind of understand where I'm going with this, is that there's a compensation that has to happen. So maybe you need glasses to see far away, but if you're looking at a screen, you take the glasses off, you can see really well. But the point that I'm trying to make is that it's important that you understand what focus is and what focus isn't. And, when you're looking at something, you need to know that you're in focus, because it's super annoying and super distracting when you're looking at video content and it's out of focus. It carries the message that you don't take things seriously, you're not putting in the amount of effort that you should be, and you are, settling for a product or content that is less than ideal. So, and if it distracts from the message that you're trying to portray in your video, then that video effectively is useless. So, focus is very important. So depending on the lens that you have, and we'll talk more about lenses in the future, but depending on the lens that you have what's called a minimum focus distance. And what that means is that you have a distance that you can focus to. Okay, so that means if you bring something closer to the camera than that minimum focus distance, the lens will not be able to focus on it. Okay, so it is important to know that, so that you're not trying to use a lens in a way that it's not designed to be used. All right, so that's focus. Now we're going to talk about focal length, and people understandably get these confused because they're very similar in terms of pronunciation. So focal length would be what you would consider zoom. Okay, that's a fairly ubiquitous term that everybody can understand. It's measured in millimeters. Depending on the kind of lens you have will determine what you can use it for. So the broad categories of lenses are a fisheye lens, which is a super wide angle. Okay, you can think of maybe a 360 video that you might be familiar with. It's super, super wide. It's usually 180 degrees, in a sphere. Okay, and you get this weird distortion, so that things in the middle seem really distorted and really stretched out. Next up in the line is the wide angle. So you still have some potential for distortion, but it allows you to effectively get more of your surroundings into your shot. Okay, next up you have the telephoto. So this is where we reach out and, like a telescope, you can bring things that are far away and make them appear like they're closer. You also have zoom lenses. Okay, so we can go from, say, a wide angle to a telephoto. There are lenses that do that. There's prime lenses that have one focal length. So instead of the zoom, that's, say, a 24 millimeter to a 70 millimeter, it's going to be one focal length. It'll be 24 millimeters. There is no zoom. You have your aperture control, which, remember, is how big the opening is, how much light we're letting in, and you have focus. That's it. A lot of the People like myself, we like prime lenses because they produce a very sharp focused image, but they also have a shallow depth of field. And so even though I'm 14 inches in front of my backdrop here, the backdrop is out of focus because I'm shooting this on a 16mm prime lens. Finally, you have macro lenses. Okay, so you remember I talked about that minimum focus distance? Well, macro lenses are designed to focus at extremely short distances. So we're talking, inches versus maybe 2 feet. All right, so depending on what you want to shoot in terms of a subject will determine what kind of a lens you need. All right, so the final thing we're going to be talking about is shooting modes. Now, depending on the camera you have will determine how many shooting modes you have. If you want to think of it as setups, okay, so depending on the mode will determine how your camera will behave. Okay, and we're going to talk about kind of the big 5. Okay, there's automatic, which hopefully you're not going to be shooting in because it's not going to generate the best image most of the time, but people use it because they don't understand what any of the other shooting modes are. All right, there's aperture priority, there's shutter priority, there's full manual, and there's program. So aperture priority is simply that. The camera will determine your shutter speed, your ISO, it'll automatically adjust all the other settings for you, but you get to choose what the aperture is going to be. So a lot of photographers and a lot of videographers, they like aperture priority because it takes all the guesswork out of all the other settings that they need to do. And they say, well, I want to shoot at f2.8. Okay, well, the camera will do everything it needs to do to allow you to shoot and get a properly exposed image at f2.8. Okay, so shutter priority is exactly like that, but you get to establish what the shutter is going to be. So, a lot of filmmakers will say, well, I want to shoot at a 24th of a second, okay, because that is the frame rate for film. And I want, a very film-like image. So it'll adjust the aperture, the ISO, and, all the other settings so that you can shoot and get a properly exposed image, if at all possible, at that shutter speed. All right. And I don't particularly like either of those because I like to have full manual control. That's just how I like to shoot. That's how I learned, and that's just the way that I do it. I'm not necessarily saying that, one is better than the other. It really has to do with your training, your experience, how you were taught, and what you prefer. Try them all. But, I like to have full manual control over my shutter speed, my aperture, my ISO, and my frame rate. So that's just the way I do it. The final one is program. And this is really kind of misleading simply because inside of program you have a selection, or a big variety in most cameras of settings. And it has to do with presets, if you will, based on the environment that you're shooting in. So, if you're shooting at the beach or in snow, that's going to set the camera up in a particular way. If you're shooting in low light or at night, it'll set up the camera in a particular way. Things like if you're shooting at night, it may or may not deactivate the flash. It may activate the flash so that, you have proper exposure. So understanding those particular program modes on your particular camera is going to be very important to, understanding how you're going to be able to consistently capture a good image. And I know that, I tend to be talking about this from a photographer standpoint, but there's a lot of crossover in terms of, shooting modes, focal lengths, focus, aperture, shutter speed, ISO. These are all basic concepts for both video and photography. So that's going to do it for this week. Be sure to stay tuned for next week where we're going to be talking about lighting, which is hugely important.